Boston, 1975. The city was a tinderbox wrapped in redcoats and resentment. Every tavern conversation carried the weight of rebellion. Every church bell could sound like an alarm. The Coercive Acts had done what years of protest could not. They'd turned argument into anger, and anger into resolve. Soldiers and citizens eyed each other across cobblestones, slick with spring rain, both sides knowing that something was coming but neither willing to admit it out loud. It was a city holding its breath before the match struck. British regulars filled the streets, polished boots, scarlet coats, musket barrels gleaming in the weak light symbols of empire and order. To the ministry in London, they were peacekeepers. To the men and women of Boston, they were occupiers. Every patrol was a reminder that the crown no longer ruled by consent but by coercion. Officers drank in taverns under the hostile gaze of men who once called them brothers. Whispers followed them down narrow alleys, not insults, but promises. The air smelled of tar, smoke, and something sharper, defiance. Beyond the city, in the quiet towns of Middlesex County, men trained in secret. They called themselves Minutemen farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers who swore to muster at a minute's warning. Their muskets were old, their powder sometimes damp, but their conviction burned hotter than any furnace. They met in barns by lantern light, drilling on frozen fields with wooden sticks when powder ran short. Every rumour from Boston, a new tax, a new shipment of troops spread like lightning through the countryside. They weren't soldiers yet, but they were ready to become them. General Thomas Gage, the King's man in Massachusetts, saw it coming too. He'd written to London that the province was on the edge of insurrection, that rebellion could be broken only by force. His orders were clear: disarm the rebels, seize the powder, arrest the ringleaders. But Gage knew the risk. The army could march on Concord or Lexington, but one wrong shot, one spark, and the whole continent might go up in flames. Even his own officers spoke of the colonies with a kind of wary respect. "They fight like devils," one said, "and they are all devils now." In taverns from Charlestown to Cambridge, the talk was no longer about petitions or protests. It was about when the British would march, not if. Lanterns flickered in windows, code between riders. Smith and Pitcairn prepared their men under the cover of darkness, unaware that word of their mission was already spreading through a network faster than any regiment could march. Before dawn, church bells would toll across the sleeping countryside, and hundreds of farmers would step out of their homes with muskets in hand, hearts pounding with a single, terrible certainty that the next sunrise would belong to war. The orders came sealed in wax and heavy with implication. General Thomas Gage read them twice beneath the flicker of a single candle, the parchment trembling slightly in his hand. London had spoken. The time for restraint was over. He was to send his men into the Massachusetts countryside to seize the rebel stores at Concord gunpowder, shot, and cannon, hidden by the militia, and, if fortune allowed, to arrest the men the Crown now called traitors, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Gage stared at the words in silence. He knew what this meant. Once his troops marched, there would be no return to peace. He closed the letter slowly, the wax seal broken like the final thread of compromise. The ministry believed a swift, decisive strike would scatter the rebellion before it found its footing. But Gage knew the people of Massachusetts better than they did. He had lived among them, watched their defiance harden with each new law. This was not a mob to be cowed. It was a people who had decided they would rather die freemen than live subjects. "If we march tonight," he muttered to his aide, "we may set the continent ablaze." Yet duty was duty. Gage summoned Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, a cautious, deliberate officer, and Major John Pitcairn of the Marines, younger, sharper, a man who believed discipline and a steady hand could tame anything. In the dim light of Province House, the plan took shape. 700 men, drawn from the finest regiments, would embark from Boston under the cover of darkness. Their orders were simple: proceed to Concord, seize or destroy all military stores, and return before daylight roused the countryside. No looting, no burning, no bloodshed unless fired upon. It was meant to be a quiet demonstration of imperial will. Outside, the spring wind hissed through the alleys of Boston, rattling the shutters as though warning them all. Smith listened to Gage's instructions, expression tight, and asked for details, routes, guides, provisions. Pitcairn simply nodded, already picturing the line of redcoats moving in ghostly silence along the road to Lexington. Neither man realized that even as they planned, riders were saddling horses beyond the city limits, lanterns ready to signal across the Charles. The colonies had eyes everywhere. By midnight, the boats were waiting at the foot of the common, oars wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. One by one, the soldiers filed down to the shore, their bayonets catching faint starlight. No drums, no fifes, only whispered orders and the soft splash of water. Behind them, the city slept uneasily, unaware that history was already in motion. Ahead of them lay 20 miles of dark road, a quiet village green, and a confrontation that would echo across centuries. The British Empire was about to learn that once liberty is threatened, even silence can turn to thunder. In the steeple of Old North Church, 2 lanterns flickered to life against the night brief, silent stars over Boston's rooftops. To those who knew the code, they spoke louder than any cannon, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Watching from the opposite bank of the Charles, Paul Revere saw the glimmer and felt his pulse quicken. The British were moving by water. He spurred his horse forward into the darkness, hooves splashing through the shallows at Charlestown. Behind him, the lights burned only a moment longer before vanishing, their signal delivered, their secret out. Revere rode hard through the sleeping countryside, wind tearing at his coat, the chill of early spring biting through his gloves. "Up an arm, the regulars are out!" he shouted as he passed through Medford, then Minutemen, his voice echoing off darkened houses. Doors flew open, candles flared to life. Men stumbled from beds and reached for muskets hung by hearths. Mothers packed powder horns and cartridges, while their husbands buckled on belts and powder pouches. Within minutes, the alarm spread farther than any single rider could carry it. Bells ringing, drums beating, dogs barking in the night. At almost the same moment, William Dawes galloped out of Boston by the longer route across the neck, dodging patrols and slipping through Roxbury Gate before it closed. His horse was slower, his road rougher, but he carried the same message. The Redcoats were on the move. By dawn, his path would cross Revere's, and together they'd reach Lexington. The colonial alarm system, a network of riders, signal fires, and word of mouth, came alive like a body jolted by lightning. It was rebellion made flesh, moving faster than the British ever imagined. Every mile, Revere covered awakened another village. In Lincoln, the bell clanged above the meeting house. In Bedford, muskets came down from pegs. In Concord, the militia captain roused his men with a single phrase, "The regulars are coming." Some doubted at first, after all, there had been false alarms before, but the urgency in Revere's voice, the pounding of hooves in the night, left no room for disbelief. The British were truly marching, and the war that had existed only in whispers was suddenly at their door. When Revere, Dawes, and a young doctor named Samuel Prescott met on the road near Lincoln, the trio became the living nerve of the rebellion. They exchanged what news they had: British strength, direction, time before spurring onward toward Concord. When a British patrol blocked their path, Dawes escaped into the darkness, Revere was captured, and Prescott alone leapt a stone wall and vanished into the fields, continuing the ride. By dawn, his warning reached Concord. Powder was hidden, men assembled, and a new nation took its first breath under a sky streaked with morning light. The alarm had been given. The countryside was awake. The Empire would never sleep soundly again. The first bell tolled in Lexington before the British were halfway from Boston. Its clang tore through the stillness like a blade, cutting sleep from every ear in the village. Within minutes, dogs barked, shutters slammed, and men stumbled into the street, pulling on coats and grabbing muskets still smelling of oil and smoke. "Turn out, the regulars are coming!" The cry carried from house to house, spreading faster than the fog that rolled in from the meadows. No one asked who had seen them. No one needed to. The sound of the bell said enough. Captain John Parker stood on the village green, lantern in one hand, frost curling from his breath. He was a veteran of the last war, a man who had fought under the British flag at Louisbourg, and he knew what was coming. His voice was calm, steady, even as his hands trembled from fever and age. "Men," he said, "if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Around him, a few dozen farmers gathered blacksmiths, wheelwrights, and boys barely grown their muskets uneven, their coats patched, their resolve unshakable. From every direction they came, drawn by the bells and by something deeper, a sense that this night was different. Drums beat in nearby villages, Woburn, Lincoln, Bedford, each rhythm a heartbeat of rebellion. Horses pounded down the roads carrying fresh warnings, hundreds of British regulars on the move, armed and marching fast. Women watched from doorways as their husbands disappeared into the dark, their silhouettes fading against the mist. A few pressed tokens into their hands, a prayer book, a lock of hair, a kiss that might be the last. In Concord, Colonel James Barrett stood at his doorway, watching the glow of lanterns on the horizon. The British would be there by morning. He sent his sons to move the gunpowder, the muskets, and the shot from the militia depot to hidden barns and cellars across the countryside. "Keep it quiet," he said. "They must find nothing." Behind him, the town green filled with armed men, some still in nightshirts, others with powder horns slung across their shoulders. The air smelled of tallow, cold iron, and fear disguised as purpose. By the time midnight gave way to dawn, Middlesex County was awake. From steeples and meadows, from barns and taverns, the call had gone out. The regulars were marching. Men who had never fired a shot in anger now cleaned their muskets by candlelight, hands steady, hearts hammering. They were not soldiers, not yet, but something had shifted. In the chill of that April morning, beneath the tolling bells and the grey sky, the line between subject and citizen quietly vanished. The revolution had begun, and the world just didn't know it yet. The tide was low when the first boats pushed off from the Boston shore. Oars dipped in silence, their blades wrapped in cloth. The only sound the whisper of water and the distant creak of leather harness. 700 men, light infantry and grenadiers from His Majesty's regiments crouched shoulder to shoulder in the darkness, their red coats hidden beneath great grey cloaks. They had marched in wars before, but never like this. No drums, no colours, no glory, just orders whispered like secrets. Concord, the rebel stores, no shooting unless fired upon. By the time they landed at Lechmere Point, the moon had vanished behind clouds, leaving the world black and breathless. The men slogged through the marsh, muskets held high, water lapping at their knees. Officers hissed quiet commands, "Close ranks, keep your pace," their voices nearly swallowed by the sucking mud. Behind them, Boston's lanterns flickered faintly across the water, the last trace of the city before the long, uncertain road ahead. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith rode at the head, wrapped tight against the cold, his face pale beneath his cocked hat. He knew the mission's promise of no trouble was a polite fiction. The column wound west through Cambridge and Minutemen, wheels wrapped in cloth to mute the rumble of the artillery carts. The night air was thick with the smell of rain and oil. Every village they passed seemed asleep, yet the feeling of being watched never left them. A curtain shifting here, a door closing there, hints of eyes in the dark. Pitcairn rode beside Smith, his temper sharp even in whispers. "They'll know we're coming," he muttered. "They always do." Smith said nothing. His orders were to reach Concord before dawn. He would obey them, even if the whole countryside woke to his march. The road climbed and fell, slick with mud. Packs grew heavier, muskets chafed at shoulders. A few soldiers stumbled, cursed under their breath, were shushed by their sergeants. They were professional men, trained to precision, but this was no parade ground. The countryside closed in dark trees, stone walls, the constant hiss of the wind through the fields. Somewhere far ahead, a bell began to toll. Then another, The sound rolled toward them like thunder. By the time the first light touched the eastern sky, the men of the column were soaked, hungry, and uneasy. They had marched into enemy country without a shot fired, but every instinct told them it would not stay that way for long. Pitcairn looked west, toward Lexington, and could see a faint glow on the horizon lanterns, maybe, or something burning. The silence around them grew heavier. Muskets were checked, bayonets fixed. 700 soldiers trudged onward into history, each step carrying them closer to the moment when the Empire's command would meet a farmer's defiance and the world would change forever. Dawn crept over Lexington in a thin grey light, soft and cold as breath on glass. The frost still clung to the grass when the bell began to toll again, slower now, but steady, relentless. From every house along the green, doors opened and men stepped into the chill morning air, muskets in hand, coats half-buttoned, the smell of wood smoke mixed with gun oil and damp earth. Chickens scattered across the yards as the first company of militiamen gathered in small knots, yawning, murmuring, waiting for orders that no one fully understood. Captain John Parker stood in the middle of the green, his silhouette etched against the rising Sunday. He was 46, a carpenter by trade, thin from illness but still straight-backed, his musket resting in the crook of his arm. Years earlier, he had fought with the British against the French. Now he faced the grim possibility of fighting them again, not as an ally, but as an enemy. "Stand your ground," he told the men who had come. "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The words hung in the cold air like smoke. Around him, roughly 70 men formed into ranks: farmers, blacksmiths, fathers and sons. Some wore powder horns and cartridge boxes. Others carried muskets older than they were. The drummers were boys. The flag was a hastily stitched banner of Liberty blue. No one expected to defeat 700 regulars. They weren't here to win, only to show they would stand. From the tavern across the road came whispers that the British were less than a mile away. Parker nodded once, grimly. He ordered the roll called, and each man answered as though he were signing a declaration with his voice. At Buckman's Tavern, John Hancock and Samuel Adams were finishing hurried breakfasts when a rider burst in with the news the British column was at the edge of town. Their host, Jonas Clark, insisted they leave immediately. Hancock bristled. He wanted to stay, to see what would happen. "No," Adams told him sharply. "You are too important to fall today." Within minutes, the two men were bundled onto horses and led north through the orchards, away from the sound of approaching drums. They disappeared just as the first scarlet coats came into view through the morning haze. The green was quiet for a moment, a silence too still to last. Birds rose from the trees as the rhythmic tramp of boots grew louder, closer. The red line of British soldiers appeared over the crest of the road, bayonets flashing like mirrors in the dawn. Parker's men shifted their weight, fingers tight on their muskets. For an instant, both sides paused, staring across the narrow stretch of grass that separated empire from rebellion. Then a command rang out, sharp and indistinct. Somewhere, a trigger clicked, and history held its breath. The Redcoats came down the road at a quick march, their boots striking the frozen ground in perfect rhythm, bayonets glinting under the rising Sunday. Major John Pitcairn rode at their head, his voice cutting through the morning mist. "Front rank, halt! Form line." The British light infantry spread across the road in a single sweep of motion, polished steel, scarlet cloth, the disciplined machine of empire. Ahead of them, on the village green, 70 men stood in ragged ranks, muskets held at their sides, faces pale in the cold. Between them lay only 60 paces of open grass, a distance no wider than a heartbeat. Pitcairn reined in his horse, surveying the small knot of militiamen before him. To his eyes, they were not soldiers at all, farmers with hunting pieces, standing stupidly where they had no business being. "Disperse, ye rebels," he shouted. "Lay down your arms and disperse." His men stood ready, muskets half raised, breath steaming in the chill air. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Captain John Parker's voice came low and steady. "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon." The words carried down the line. quiet but defiant, a final warning to the world that something irreversible was about to happen. The stillness was unbearable. Smoke from a nearby chimney drifted across the green, curling around the British line like a veil. A dog barked, a musket lock clicked somewhere too close, too sudden. And then it came, one sharp, solitary crack. No one ever agreed who fired it, or from which side. But that single sound tore through the air like thunder. Within seconds, both lines erupted. The British volley flashed white in the dawn, their gunfire echoing off the houses that ringed the common. Militiamen staggered, stumbled, fell. Others returned fire through the smoke, their shots wild but desperate. The neat geometry of battle dissolved into chaos. Pitcairn shouted himself hoarse, trying to regain control. "Cease fire! Cease fire! Damn you!" But the soldiers were beyond hearing. Caught between fear and training, the instinct to fire overpowering command. The smell of burnt powder filled the green, thick and acrid. Men ran in every direction, smoke swirling around their legs like fog. Horses reared, muskets cracked, and the morning sun broke fully over the horizon, turning the smoke to gold and the blood on the grass to black. When the echoes finally faded, 8 colonists lay dead or dying, 10 more wounded. One British soldier was grazed, another bleeding from a shattered thumb. The rest stood in uneasy silence, staring at what they had done. Across the green, Parker's surviving men dragged their fallen comrades from the frost, faces hollow with disbelief. The Redcoats reformed, reloaded, and continued their march toward Concord. Behind them, Lexington smouldered in the early light, a village that had just become the first battlefield of a revolution. The air hung heavy with breath and tension, every man on the green frozen in that fragile instant between peace and ruin. The British line stood rigid, bayonets poised, their scarlet coats stark against the grey dawn. Across the field, Parker's men gripped their muskets, faces pale but unflinching. And then it came. A single, sharp crack split the morning. No one could say from where. Some swore it came from behind a hedge, others from a nervous hand within the ranks. But once the sound broke the silence, nothing could stop what followed. The British line flinched, then answered as one. A flash of white smoke erupted from their muskets, the volley slamming into the militia like thunder rolling across the earth. Men jerked backward, struck down mid-breath. One fell still, clutching his musket. Another stumbled into the frost, clutching his chest. The air filled with the hiss of lead and the smell of burnt powder. Horses screamed, commands vanished in the roar, and the morning calm of Lexington shattered forever. The militia tried to return fire, their shots ragged and desperate. Smoke curled low across the field, wrapping both lines in a ghostly haze. The green became a blur of motion, red, blue, grey as men ran, fell, rose again. Parker shouted for his men to disperse, his voice barely audible over the crack of musketry. Some obeyed, slipping behind stone walls and fences. Others stood their ground and fired again, defiant to the end. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting faltered. The smoke drifted away to reveal bodies strewn across the common, 8 colonists dead, 10 wounded. The British stood amid the haze, reloading in grim silence, the weight of what had happened settling like lead. Pitcairn barked orders to reform, his face pale beneath his hat. Across the green, the survivors of Lexington's militia carried their dead from the frost, disbelief etched in every movement. The British column began to march again, boots striking the road toward Concord. Behind them lay a field stained with blood, a small patch of Massachusetts earth that had become something far greater. The sound of that first shot still echoed across the farms and rivers of New England, across an empire that stretched over oceans, across history itself. It was the shot heard round the world, the moment when subjects became soldiers and a rebellion became a revolution. The smoke drifted low over Lexington Green, curling through the cold morning air like breath from the dead. The regulars stood where they had fired, their ranks reformed in uneasy silence. The echo of musketry still seemed to linger, bouncing off the houses that framed the field. For a moment, no one moved. Then a single moan rose from the grass, faint, human, and terrible. The cost of a few minutes and a single misread order now lay scattered across the frost. Captain John Parker knelt beside one of his men, the life already gone from him. His hand trembled as he brushed the soot from the man's coat. He had warned them not to fire unless fired upon, had hoped to show resolve without sparking war. But war had come anyway, uninvited, unstoppable. Around him, his surviving militiamen gathered their wounded, their faces grey with disbelief. Some cursed softly, others said nothing at all. The stillness after the volley was worse than the firing, a silence filled with things no one could take back. Major Pitcairn rode slowly along the British line, his horse stepping carefully between bodies. He had tried to stop the shooting once it began, shouting himself hoarse to no effect. Now he looked out at the aftermath, 8 colonials dead, 10 wounded, and felt no triumph, only the dull weight of something gone too far. "The fools should have dispersed," one officer muttered. Pitcairn didn't answer. He knew the truth. They had been farmers, not soldiers. And yet they had stood. The British formed up once more, bayonets gleaming, their orders to continue the march to Concord. They stepped off at the drum's slow beat, leaving behind the small New England village they had just baptized in blood. Behind them, widows and mothers crept onto the field, weeping quietly as they knelt beside husbands and sons. Smoke rose from musket flashes still burning in the grass, and the air reeked of sulphur and iron. The morning sun climbed higher, shining on blood-darkened frost and scattered muskets. The green, so ordinary only an hour before, had become sacred ground, the place where empire and liberty first collided. There was no proclamation, no banner raised, no declaration read aloud, only silence, and the certainty that nothing in the world would ever be the same. The regulars held the field, but they had lost something greater, the illusion that obedience could ever again hold America. The British column left Lexington in grim silence, their boots thudding in rhythm on the rutted road. Powder smoke still clung to their coats, and the metallic scent of blood followed them like a shadow. Behind them lay the green and its dead. Ahead waited the long road to Concord. Lieutenant Colonel Smith rode at the head, his jaw clenched tight. The plan had been to seize rebel stores quietly, to strike without incident. Now, the quiet was gone, replaced by a low, invisible hum in the air, the sound of a countryside awakening to war. As the column wound through the farmlands, faces appeared in the tree lines and behind stone walls. Farmers stood with muskets in their hands, watching in silence as the red line passed. No one spoke. No one fired. But each man who watched turned and ran for his horse, his drum, or his town bell. Within minutes, the alarm rippled outward again through Lincoln, Bedford, and Acton, the echo of Lexington carried on every wind. The British marched on, unaware of how many eyes tracked their every step. The road narrowed between hills, crossed small bridges, past barns and orchards thick with shadow. Pitcairn rode beside Smith, scanning the woods, uneasy. "They're moving out there," he said quietly. "I can feel it." Smith gave no reply, but his hand rested on the hilt of his sword. The regulars tightened ranks, their red coats a moving target in the pale morning light. Behind the column, in every hamlet and hollow, Minutemen were gathering. They came from their fields, still wet with dew, from workshops and taverns, from miles away on the back roads that threaded the countryside. Muskets were loaded, powder horns filled. Some rode, others ran, all converging on the same thought: the British were marching to Concord, and they would not be allowed to reach it unopposed. By the time Smith's column crested the last ridge before Concord, the fields on either side of the road were alive with movement. Men slipped between trees, vanished into hollows, reappeared along fences. A church bell clanged in the distance, answered by another farther off. The sound rolled like thunder across the hills. The British kept marching, boots splashing through puddles, muskets at the ready. But the hills were watching now, and they were no longer silent. Every hedge and woodlot hid a rifle. Every mile drew them deeper into a trap built not by generals, but by the will of a people who had decided they would be conquered no more. The town of Concord stirred to life beneath a grey, windless sky. Church bells rang not for worship, but for war. From the meeting house came the steady tramp of boots, as militiamen gathered farmers, tradesmen, and boys scarcely old enough to shave. They came with powder horns slung over shoulders, muskets glinting with oil, and faces set with the quiet resolve of men who knew history was now their burden. The British were coming, and by mid-morning they would be here. In Colonel James Barrett's farmhouse, the militia leaders argued in hushed tones around a table strewn with maps and powder horns. Some urged caution to stand aside, let the regulars take what they came for, avoid bloodshed if possible. Others spoke with fire in their eyes. "If we yield today," one said, "we will yield forever." Barrett listened, then made his decision. The stores of powder and shot, the cannon and musket balls, would be moved, scattered across the farms and hidden in cellars and haylofts. Let the British march all day, they would find nothing but empty barns and determined men. Outside, wagons creaked into motion, wheels muffled with rags, barrels of powder rolled under hay, muskets were buried beneath sacks of grain. Women and children joined in the work, their faces pale but steady. "Take it west," Barrett ordered, pointing toward Acton. "They mustn't find a thing." Within hours, the heart of Concord's defence, its supplies vanished into the countryside. What remained was spirit, and that could not be seized. By late morning, scouts brought word that the British were approaching. The main column had stopped to rest, but advanced troops were moving fast. The militia marched out of town, up the ridge beyond the meeting house, and took position overlooking the North Bridge. From that rise they could see everything: the winding river below, the distant glint of redcoats crossing fields, and the smoke of their own town where the British search parties would soon arrive. The North Bridge, wooden and narrow, spanned more than water now. It was the thin thread binding defiance and disaster. Reverend William Emerson stood among the men, musket in hand, his black cloak whipping in the wind. "The day is the Lord's," he said quietly. No one answered, but heads nodded all the same. They watched as the British entered Concord, smoke rising from barns where searches began. To the men on the ridge, it looked like the town was burning. Someone muttered, "They mean to destroy us." Major Buttrick tightened his grip on his musket and gave the order to advance. The column moved downhill toward the bridge, the wind carrying the smell of smoke and river water. The moment had come when talk would end, and America would learn to fight. Smoke drifted over Concord, a pale ribbon against the morning sky. From the ridge above the river, the militia watched the haze thicken, dark and bitter. Some swore they saw flames licking at rooftops. "They're burning the town," someone shouted. Anger spread through the ranks like fire through dry grass. Major John Buttrick raised his sword and turned to his men, farmers, blacksmiths and fathers who had never fought a battle but knew injustice when they saw it. "March," he commanded. "Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to burn our homes, then let it be answered." 2 companies, Acton and Concord men, stepped forward, their captain, Isaac Davis, leading from the front. "I haven't a man who is afraid to go," he had said moments before, and none had challenged him. They advanced down the slope toward the North Bridge, drums beating slow and steady, the sound hollow over the river's rush. Below them, across the bridge, a detachment of British light infantry stood guard redcoats bright against the dark planks, their muskets levelled, uncertain of what was coming. Buttrick halted the column within musket range and called out, his voice carrying across the water, "We will not fire first." For a moment, only the wind answered. Then, from the British line, a shot cracked one, then 2 more. Davis staggered, a musket ball through his chest. Another militiaman fell beside him, splashing into the shallow water. "Fire! For God's sake, fire!" Buttrick shouted. The volley that answered rolled like thunder through the valley. Smoke engulfed the bridge. Lead hissed across the river, striking wood and water, finding flesh. The British fired back, then faltered, the weight of numbers and surprise breaking their line. Some turned and ran, others hesitated, stumbling as the provincials surged forward. The disciplined regulars, trained for open fields and formal ranks, found themselves outflanked by farmers shooting from trees and fence lines. In minutes, the red line dissolved, retreating in confusion toward the town they had just searched. When the smoke cleared, 2 Americans lay dead, 3 British soldiers beside them. Blood streaked the bridge planks, mingling with river water. The militia held the crossing, stunned by what they had done. For the first time, British troops had been driven back by American arms. Buttrick looked down at the fallen and then toward the town, where the Redcoats were gathering again in alarm. "The day has begun," he said quietly. Behind him, the men reloaded, the flints clicking in unison. The bridge belonged to them now, and the Empire had taken its first step backward. The alarm spread faster than any horse could gallop. From Lincoln's stone-walled farms, from Bedford's green, from Acton's muddy lanes, the countryside rose as one. Bells clanged, drums thudded, and men poured from their homes with muskets on their shoulders and powder horns clattering at their sides. Some had marched through the night from towns 20 miles away, following the echo of distant volleys. Others came barefoot, muskets still warm from the hearth where they'd been oiled only hours before. No one needed orders. The cause was simple, and it burned in every chest. The regulars had fired on their own people. The roads east toward Lexington filled with a tide of armed men. They came in small groups, 5 here, 10 there, converging on crossroads and taverns to form companies. The sun was higher now, glinting off the river and the metal of hastily loaded guns. Farmers with fowling pieces stood beside veterans of the last war. Boys, barely 16, carried muskets, almost as long as they were tall. Some had no uniforms, no bayonets, not even powder to spare. But they had courage, and that was enough. On the ridges overlooking the Concord Road, scouts watched the British reform their ranks and begin to march back toward Boston. "They're retreating," one man said, disbelief giving way to a grim smile. It was true for the first time. The mighty red column was moving backward. Word spread fast. Militia captains barked orders. Men took positions behind stone walls, and the old pasture fences of Middlesex became a battlefield. The British would not leave Concord unchallenged. As the red line wound through the fields and forests, every curve in the road hid danger. A musket cracked from behind a tree. A puff of white smoke rose from a haystack. The regulars answered with volleys into empty woods, but the rebels had already melted away, only to reappear farther down the road. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was a hunt, and the British were the quarry. By midday, the roads from every direction were choked with militia, thousands now, all moving east. The noose was tightening with every step. Men who had never seen each other before fought side by side, reloading and firing in perfect rhythm, their hearts pounding with the realization that the impossible had begun. The British Army, masters of half the world, was being chased through New England by farmers. The Empire's long shadow was retreating down the dusty road to Boston, and behind it marched a nation still too new to know its own name. The road from Concord was littered with smoke and echoes the echo of shots from unseen men, the smoke of musket fire that came and vanished before a single redcoat could aim in reply. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith rode at the center of the column, his horse slick with sweat, his uniform spattered with mud. He had set out from Boston to seize rebel stores and restore order. Now, with every mile, order was slipping through his fingers. His men were exhausted, their ammunition running low, their discipline stretched thin by an enemy that would not show itself. They had fought on battlefields before straight lines, clear commands, drums to guide their fire. But this was something else entirely. The woods on either side of the road spat fire and vanished. Men fell from unseen bullets. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear above the constant rattle of musketry. The heat of midday turned the road into a trap of dust and confusion. Smith rode forward, eyes scanning the hills. He could see shadows moving behind stone walls, hear the crack of shots that came from everywhere at once. His line was collapsing by inches. "Sir, we cannot advance another mile like this." One captain gasped. Blood streaked across his face. Smith didn't answer right away. He knew the truth before the words left the man's mouth. Ammunition wagons had been lost in the confusion. Men were firing their last cartridges. Every musket raised meant another that would soon be empty. There was only one choice left: to fall back or die standing still. "Sound the recall," Smith ordered quietly. "We turn for Boston." Major John Pitcairn galloped through the column, his voice sharp, cutting through the chaos. "Close ranks! Close up, you fools!" He rode up and down the line, rallying stragglers, cursing and coaxing in equal measure. His Marines fell back in measured steps, covering the retreat with volley after volley, each shot a wall of smoke between life and death. Pitcairn's calm under fire held the column together by sheer will discipline against despair. Behind them, the hills burned with musket flashes. Ahead lay miles of hostile country and no guarantee of relief. The once proud British column, that had marched out in silence and precision before dawn, was now a bleeding, disordered snake winding its way home. Smith rode at its head, jaw tight, every hoofbeat a reminder of failure. The mission had begun as a show of strength. It was ending as a retreat, and as the countryside closed in behind them, every musket crack whispered the same truth: the Empire's march had turned into a flight. The first ambush came at Merriam's Corner. The British column had just crossed a narrow bridge when a sudden volley burst from the trees to their left. The sound was deafening, a rolling thunder of muskets from farmers crouched behind walls and fences. Redcoats fell in the road, their ranks thrown into confusion. Smith shouted for order. Pitcairn's Marines wheeled to face the threat, but by the time they returned fire, the militiamen were gone, slipping through the woods like ghosts. The road ahead seemed quiet again, but every man knew it was an illusion. As the column moved on, the pattern repeated. At Brooks Hill, at every curve of the road, smoke flared from behind boulders and hedgerows, from barns and orchards. Men fired from windows and vanished before the Redcoats could reload. The British were trained for battlefields, for open ground and clear targets, not for an invisible enemy that struck and vanished. "They fight like devils," a grenadier muttered between clenched teeth. Smith could only nod. His men were being hunted, not fought. The countryside itself seemed to rise against them. At the bloody angle, a sharp bend in the road, hundreds of militiamen waited in perfect silence until the first British platoon entered the kill zone. Then the air exploded. Fire came from both sides, a storm of lead and smoke that shredded the red line in seconds. Men screamed, stumbled, fell into the ditch. Officers waved swords and shouted, trying to form firing lines, but there was no formation, left only chaos. The smell of powder and blood filled the air, thick and choking. Pitcairn rode through the carnage, shouting himself hoarse. "Keep moving! Keep the column together!" He swung his sabre toward the hills, urging his Marines to cover the flanks while Smith's main body pressed on. Every step was a gamble, every shadow could hide a rifle. The wounded were left by the roadside. There was no time to carry them. The neat precision of morning had become a desperate crawl through death. By afternoon, the road to Boston was a corridor of fire. Smoke hung in the treetops, the sky alive with the crack of distant muskets. Each village they passed added new fury to the chase, more men joining from fields and workshops, their shots harassing the column like angry hornets. The British fought every step, disciplined still, but breaking inside. When they finally reached the outskirts of Lexington, their faces were grey with exhaustion, their cartridge boxes nearly empty. The proud march that had left Boston before dawn was gone. What limped toward the city now was something else entirely, the remnant of an army learning the terrible price of underestimating rebellion. By mid-afternoon, the shattered column stumbled back into Lexington, uniforms torn, faces blackened by powder and smoke, men limping from exhaustion and wounds. Their cartridges were nearly gone, their ranks thinned by miles of ambush. Smith rode with his arm bandaged, Pitcairn's horse lathered white with sweat. The red line that had left Boston in perfect order that morning was now little more than a bleeding remnant. Just beyond the town green, salvation waited in the form of Lord Percy's brigade. 1,200 fresh troops, drums rolling, bayonets glittering in the harsh Sunday. Percy had heard the gunfire long before he saw the retreating men. Now, watching them stagger in, he understood the scale of disaster. "Good God," he muttered. "Another hour, and they'd have been destroyed." His men opened ranks to let the survivors through, then closed like a steel gate. Cannon were unlimbered and rolled into position on the rise above the town. The guns' muzzles gleamed like the teeth of some great beast. When the militia pressed too close, Percy gave the order. The first British artillery of the war roared out, scattering rebels from stone walls and farmyards. The thunder echoed across the fields, not victory, but reprieve. For the first time in hours, the regulars rested. Wounded men collapsed beside the road, drinking from muddy ditches. Officers tried to reform ranks, count heads, refill cartridge boxes, but the numbers made no sense, too many gone, too many left behind. Percy moved among them, calm and commanding, his presence a wall against panic. "You will march in order," he told them, voice low but firm. "You will not disgrace the king's uniform." And somehow, they obeyed. The respite was brief. Around Lexington, the hills crawled with movement militia companies from every direction, closing in again. From the tree lines came the telltale puffs of musket smoke, random at first, then steady. Percy's cannon answered, but the shots were wasted on shadows. The rebels would not stand and fight. They struck and vanished, the woods swallowing them whole. Percy knew this march home would not be a parade, it would be a gauntlet, and his men would pay for every step. As the column formed once more and began its slow advance toward Boston, the sun dipped low behind them, casting long crimson shadows down the road. Artillery rumbled, wounded, groaned, and from the ridges came the relentless crack of distant guns. The British army, still proud, still disciplined, trudged on beneath the rain of fire, its polished order giving way to grim endurance. Lexington faded behind them, but the war they had tried to prevent now followed like a shadow. And every musket shot from the dark whispered the same truth. The rebellion had learned to fight, and it would never stop. By the time the sun touched the horizon, the British column had become a ghost of itself, a long, staggering line of men dragging their feet through the bloodied dust. Their red coats were torn, their faces grey with exhaustion and powder smoke. Lord Percy rode at the rear, his eyes scanning the hills that still spat musket fire at every turn. The roar of artillery had faded to sporadic shots now, but the danger was everywhere invisible, constant. Only when the spires of Charlestown appeared through the smoke did the soldiers dare to believe they might live to see nightfall. As they descended toward the river, the boom of Royal Navy cannon rolled across the water, a sound that felt like salvation. Warships anchored in the Charles opened their guns on the hillsides, sending iron and flame into the woods where the last militia companies fired from cover. The ground trembled under the barrage. The harassing fire thinned, then stopped altogether. At last, the Redcoats stumbled into Charlestown, collapsing behind the safety of the guns. They fell where they stood in doorways, in fields, against walls too tired even to speak. The dead were left behind on the road, the wounded carried on makeshift litters. Water was poured into cracked lips, bandages torn from shirts. Officers counted survivors and found the numbers unbearable, nearly 300 killed or wounded, and many more missing. The men who had marched out before dawn were no longer soldiers of empire. They were survivors of something none of them yet had words for. Across the river, on the far hills and fields, the militia gathered. Thousands of men from every corner of Massachusetts stood under the dimming sky, muskets resting on their shoulders, smoke still drifting from the barrels. They had not driven the British into the sea, but they had done something greater. They had trapped them. From Roxbury to Charlestown, the roads were lined with armed men, the circle tightening as the stars came out. What had begun as a march to seize powder had ended as a siege. As darkness fell over Boston, the lanterns of the Royal Navy glimmered on the harbour waters, reflections trembling like the last heartbeat of an old world. Inside the city, soldiers tended to their wounded beneath the distant toll of church bells. Outside, on the hills, farmers turned, soldiers took up watch by their campfires. their faces lit in the glow of flames and resolve. Between them stretched the quiet river, one side empire, the other rebellion, and for the first time in history, the British Army slept behind its own guns. The siege of Boston had begun, and with it, the American Revolution. By dawn the next day, the smoke had drifted out to sea, but the smell of powder still clung to the air. Along the roads from Lexington to Charlestown lay the wreckage of an empire's illusion, broken muskets, torn cartridge boxes, and the bodies of men who had never expected to fight that day. For the British, it was a tactical retreat. For the colonists, it was a revelation. They had stood against the King's army and lived. The toll was staggering. 73 Redcoats dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. The colonists had lost 49 dead and 39 wounded, but they had gained something that could never be counted in numbers. The news spread faster than any courier could carry it. By the time Gage's troops limped back into Boston, riders were already galloping toward New York, Philadelphia, and beyond. Each mile turned the skirmishes into legend. In taverns and meeting houses, men recited the story in whispers. Farmers with muskets had stood their ground, and the greatest army in the world had been driven back to the sea. The shot heard round the world had become not a rumour but a rallying cry. Across Massachusetts, committees of safety gathered sworn depositions from eyewitnesses, farmers, ministers, even boys who had watched from behind fences. Each account told the same truth. The regulars had fired first. Those words, copied and carried to every colony, struck like thunder. In London, they would be dismissed as lies. In America, they became scripture. In Boston, Gage fortified the city. Outside its walls, 20,000 militiamen dug trenches and built redoubts. The siege line stretched from Roxbury to the Mystic River, a ring of defiance drawn in powder and prayer. The battle was over, but the war of words had just begun. Paul Revere engraved the first images within weeks, British soldiers firing in ordered volleys, Americans falling in the smoke, the innocent struck down, copies spread through the colonies, hung in taverns and churches, stoking outrage and unity. For every musket fired on the 19th of April, 1,000 pens now took up the cause. Petitions to the Crown gave way to proclamations, and quiet loyalty hardened into rebellion. By summer, the world had changed. The colonies no longer spoke of grievances, but of freedom. Men who had begged for reconciliation now spoke of independence. The King's authority had ended at the edge of the bayonets that glimmered across the Charles. In that single day's march from Boston to Concord and back again, 13 scattered provinces had found a single purpose. The fields of Middlesex were still and green once more, but the sound of that first shot still echoed through them, a reminder that history had turned its face toward revolution, and there was no turning it back.